Have you ever felt like your school, district, university, or organization was proclaiming equity but still practicing racism? Or have you ever found yourself in a so-called equity space, but it feels like everything other than equity? Well, if you answer yes to either of these questions, then you're in the right place. On today's episode, I'm going to talk to you about 6 functions of what I call racism in the name of equity and what you can do about it. Hi, I'm Dr. Terrance L. I'm a tenured professor, and I've helped to prepare hundreds of racially just and anti-racist school leaders, and I want to help you. That's why I created this podcast to provide you and your team with real-world insights and practices that work so that you can collectively build racially just schools. So if you are ready to hop into today's episode, hey, let's go.
You're listening to the Racially Just Schools podcast, the show that provides resources to help you and your team build racially just schools. Now, here's your host, Dr. Terrance L.
Welcome to the Racially Just Schools podcast. My name is Terrance L. and I am your host. And I am once again super excited and elated that you are here for today's episode. Now, on today's episode, I'm going to be talking to you about something that I think is super important that, just really needs to be talked about. And many folks are talking about it, but I want to approach it in a particular way. And so as I was thinking and preparing about today's episode, I found something in my phone that I started writing, and I actually dated it October 15, 2018. And at that time, I was working with several districts and schools on racial justice work, and I began to notice some patterns across and not only just the schools and districts that I was working with, but conversations I started having with friends and with colleagues and folks who are engaged in, racial justice and equity work in schools. And over the years, I began to see those patterns continue to emerge. And it was interesting because often in these spaces, I would hear people talk about and espouse how they wanted equity and they wanted, racial justice work. But in many ways, it was racism all over again. And I want to talk to you today about this idea that I call racism in the name of equity. And the reason I call it that is because it is still racism, but it is racism under the cloak of equity, right? So in other words, it is the same old systems that advantage white people and the systems that are set up based on race. Think about Dr. Beverly Tatum's definition of racism as an entry point into thinking about this. And they're far more nuanced and complex than theoretically robust ideas around what racism is. But I like her definition because we get to put racism in this dynamic of like a system, right? It moves us just beyond these individual animus or individual attitudes or preference or cognition to like these larger systems that are at play. But it's a system of advantage based on race, particularly systems of advantage that were created to benefit white people. And so when we think about racism in the name of equity, it is that same system that is at play, but it just puts on the cover or the cloak or the outfit of equity. But if you just rip up that name of equity, you'll see all along it's still that same system that is at play. And I want to talk to you about 6 ways in which this can function. There are many, many more ways than 6, but I want to just highlight kind of like 6 ways in which I've experienced and which I've been a part of to see the insidiousness of this play out. But as I do that, I want to ask you and pose some questions to you to help you thinking about what you might do instead, right? So on the one hand, we want to start to identify this when it shows up. But we also want to be able to think about what are the questions we need to be asking ourselves, asking our team, asking our collective and the people that we're engaged in this work with so that we can move through this to create and to build a new possibility so that it won't be racism in the name of equity, but it'll actually be racial justice that has a material and a substantive and a robust impact in the lives of youth, of children, of adults, of everybody who's involved in the work that we do in our context. All right. So let's get into it. One of the ways that racism shows up in the name of equity is when you think that an equity committee or diversity, equity, and inclusion task force is going to be enough to bring about racial justice. And this is, I think, a very limiting perspective, particularly when the committee and the task force don't have the resources, the organizational authority, or transform power dynamics to bring about racial justice, right? And as I start to unpack this, I first want to pause and just acknowledge and thank people and everyone who served on any of these committees or is currently serving on them, because in many instances, I don't believe the work is in vain. I believe people are doing the very best that they can. And sometimes it's people that have gotten together in a school or a district, like, look, we got to just get something going. And so they start to get like-minded people together. And so that work should be lauded and deeply appreciative. And I'm grateful for folks who are engaged in that. And I want to be honest too, though, the reality is that you cannot committee your way out of racism. You cannot program your way out of racism. You cannot DEI your way out of racism. You simply can't. And, even thinking about this, committees and task force, like a DEI task force, the thing is, like, racial justice is not a task, right? It is literally the essence or an essence of a particular school or a district or a classroom or your organization. And the idea of a task, it denotes that you do something, you check off the box, it's done, and you move on. And the reality is that this is not that type of work. This work is not just a task or something for a committee. This is the work of a district. This is the work of a classroom. This is the work of a school. This is the soil, partly or significant part of the soil in which everything else emerges. Our instruction emerges from racial justice. Our engagement and partnership with families and communities emerge from racial justice. Our hiring practices emerge from racial justice. Our analysis of data and making sense of what's happening with students, that emerges from racial justice. The way that we engage with people and their humanity, that emerges from this idea of racial justice. All of the work that we do emerges from that. This is not just a task. This is not just a technical challenge that we have, like, the carburetor in your car went out, so we just go get it fixed, or the racial justice carburetor went out, so we just fix it. And no, this is not that. This is deep, substantive, material work. Okay, and I think the limitation is when we think that just having a committee, so the committee is formed or the task force is formed, and again, particularly they had a resource and the authority to make the change that would need to be made. A lot of times schools and districts will point to that, or even organizations that, like, look, there it is, we're doing equity, and they'll point to that. But the underlying system, the underlying structure that has been set up to advantage based on race, that hasn't shifted. It hasn't changed. And so it is equity all in the name of racism. So it can cloak racism, and it looks like a lot of progress is being made, but in all actuality, it could be producing actually even more harm. And so that's why it's incumbent upon us to start to acknowledge this, to name this, and to begin to ask ourselves some important questions, ask our team some questions as we think about the creation of task force and the creations of committees. Listen, if task force and committees could bring about racial justice, a whole bunch of schools and districts should be racially just, because there are enough task force and committees to go around, plus some. Okay, but there's some questions I think that we can ask to use and leverage what we have to create these new possibilities to make this work substantive and materially robust and powerful. So the question that I want to ask you to help to shift your work and to shift your practice and to shift the things that are happening with the committees that you have. And then I want to say, if you have a committee or if you have a task force, amen. I'm grateful. I'm thankful that there are people, because folks like, shoot, it took us a lot just to get this committee now, brother. Hold on now. No, I'm happy for you. I am grateful. And what I also want to encourage you is to not allow that committee to be pigeonholed, right? And not allow the work that you're doing to impact what's happening across your entire school or your entire district. And so one of the questions I want you to be reflective of is this: what is the purpose of your committees in making material and substantive racial justice changes within your context? And what metrics or parameters or like what will you use to determine that. So I'll put that question again. The question is this: what is the purpose of your committees in making material and substantive racial justice changes within your context? And what metrics will you use to determine that? Another way that racism in the name of equity emerges is through uncritical inclusion. I call it this uncritical inclusion. And that is when schools, districts, when classrooms, or any organization is when they include Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander, youth, families, community, adults into the existing organization. Or in other words, they include them into an existing white supremacy culture, white structures, and white systems. And so, oftentimes the spotlight is shed on, like, we are including, for example, more Black people and more Black families in our community engagement. And on one hand, I'm like, that's wonderful, that's great. And then the expansiveness of the light needs to be shed on including them into what, right? So it's not enough to just say we've included more, but the question is into what? Particularly if white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial injustice is the default that is constantly being perpetuated, you're just including more people into the same mess that you already have. It's the same thing, in school desegregation. Particularly I'm thinking about in the 50s after Brown v. Board 1 and Brown v. 2, as schools start to desegregate, and people are like, well, we've included more Black folks in white schools. I'm like, I don't want that. You know what I'm saying? I'm included or integrated into what? If the schools and the systems were already anti-Black, just including more Black people in a system of anti-Blackness is racism in the name of desegregation, right? So that is not enough. And I'm grateful and thankful, talk to districts and stuff, and they're like, well, we just hired our very first Black principal, or our very first Black superintendent, or our very first is such and such. And I'm like, that's great and that's awesome. But now you've hired them into a particular type of system or structure, right? And so if we're thinking about if that person or people can really have the impact that they need, then what they're coming into has to transform. Is not enough to just have the presence of a Black body in a system of white supremacy. That is not enough. And that is why the work of diversity, which is primarily focused on representation, can be so limiting on a structural level, right? On a symbolic level, you like, oh, I'm so happy, I'm thankful, I'm grateful. There's someone who looks like me. I appreciate that. I'm grateful and thankful for that. But on a structural, material level, you're like, all right, the larger question is now, it's not enough to just be like, oh, we've included such and such or this group or whomever into this work, because the larger question is we got to actually change that work and the culture and the conditions in which people are coming into. And so the question I want to ask you here to ponder on when you're thinking about this is, has your school, your district, your organization, your professional learning community, your team, whatever context in which you're in, and I'll just say school for this particular part, has your school clarified what it means to be included? And then the second question, included into what, right? And the third part of that is, who sets the norms for what they're included into, and how does that disrupt the status quo? I'll say that again because that was kind of a lot there. The questions I want you to kind of grapple with here as we start thinking about using inquiry, start thinking about using the tensions that emerge in this work as portals, as avenues through which to engage in this, is, has your school clarified what you mean by inclusion? And who gets to set the norms for who's included, and to what degree does that now disrupt the status quo? Okay, so that's the question I want you to think about. Another way that racism in the name of equity shows up is when Black, Latinx, Pacific Islander, Asian, indigenous folks share their lived experiences and are vulnerable, but nothing changes, right? And so all this happened is that the power structure, the system, the district, the folks involved in that, they've just gained more information and more knowledge, but the routines, the ways of doing, the ways of being has never changed. And so people had conversations and they talked, but there was no power dynamics that shifted. There were no material changes that occurred. There were no actions that occurred. And so people are very transparent and vulnerable, all for nothing, right? And, I'm very selective in particular spaces about how transparent I will be, particularly if I don't believe that there is a deep commitment for people to do something about it, because all you do is just share your lived experience and you relive the racial harm that you've experienced, but all for nothing, right? So people can learn and say, oh, I am so sorry, but don't do anything to make any significant changes. And so it sounds like equity because like we've heard from all these voices and we hear your experiences, and I'm so afraid and sorry and for the racial harm that you're experiencing, but yeah, this is what we do around here. It's almost kind of like that. And so the question I think we need to ask ourselves and ask as a team to move through this and to actually not just do racism in the name of equity is, before people talk and have conversations, what are we willing to do, what we learn to make material and substantive racial justice changes? I'll ask that again. I'll say that question again. The question I think we need to grapple with, and you and your team, is this: before people talk and have courageous or crucial or any type of conversations, what are we willing to do with what we've learned to make material and substantive racial justice changes? And this is important to have, because at least when people come in to be transparent and to share their racial harms and lived experiences within that school, that system, that classroom, organization, whatever it is, you have already determined that you're going to do something about it, and you're thinking about the infrastructure that needs to be set up to actually turn the lived experiences into some actual change. Another way that racism in the name of equity can show up is when school districts or schools or organizations, they will pay millions of dollars to white consultants, but they will question the value and the worth of Black consultants and even administrators and leaders. And so I've seen this play out in so many times. I mean, sometimes districts will call it. So first off, districts have paid particularly white consultants millions and millions of dollars over the years to come in and do professional learning or development or some type of capacity building or their curriculum or whatever, that's not doing near nothing about racial justice. At best is racially neutral, but many times it's harmful, or it does everything to just maintain the status quo. And then, you have a Black administrator or a Black consultant or someone you ask to come work with your school or district, and then you take them through the gauntlet of scrutiny, of criticism, and have these unrealistic timelines and expectations of what they can do. And people will say, well, it's equity because we're bringing in a Black superintendent or a Black principal, or we have some Black board members now, or we got Black consultants working and helping us do this work. But the scrutiny and the unrealistic expectations that are placed on Black consultants and leaders is unrealistic. It's straight up unrealistic. And it's crazy that I can't tell you the number of districts, like they'll be paying, and I've had conversations with folks in my own experience, like they'll be paying like these white consultants all this money, but then they want to have all these conversations with me and waste not waste, but just like suck up all my time, and then they want to do it for free. And I don't mind helping and supporting people, but I do have an issue with you placing a value on white knowledge around racial justice and putting a premium on that with your fiscal resources and allocations, but then want to undermine and undercut, somebody who's Black, Indigenous, Asian, Pacific Islander, or Latinx who has expertise, and you're just like, let me just talk to you for the next 72 hours straight, or the one thing that, kind of alerts me when people are just like, I want to pick your brain. I mean, that just sounds colonial. That sounds just like extractive. You want to pick my brain. You literally want to go in there and just pick out what you need and extract and just leave. So when I hear that, my antennas go up. But I think the question districts and schools and organizations can start to ask is, do we have unspoken yet different standards for Black and other racially minoritized consultants or leaders? I ask that again. Do we have unspoken yet different standards for Black and other racially minoritized consultants and administrators? Another way that I think racism in the name of equity shows up is, and I've seen this, I can't tell you how many times across multiple contexts, after a racial solution or approach is put forward, there are excuses and a lack of political will to implement what needs to be done because people are afraid of what white people will think, feel, and do. And so there is more concern around maintaining and creating white comfort than there is around racial justice and Black liberation. And people, they're like, well, I don't want people to leave the district, and I don't want we're gonna lose resources. I empathize with that reality, and as long as a district is held hostage, or a school is held hostage to what white families and what white parents want, particularly when it is in opposition to doing what is best for the racial justice outcome of Black, of Indigenous, of Latinx, of Asian, Pacific Islander students, then it is nothing more than racism in the name of equity, right? And so people they'll know what they need to do. They'll put forth these things on the table, but they're so afraid to actually go through what needs to be done because they're afraid of the white families and white power structure that's going to come after. So they will much rather preserve order. They will much rather preserve the chaos than to do something profoundly powerful and profoundly different. And that makes me think of this quote by Dr. King. And Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail, which again is something I think everybody should read, in his book, Why We Can't Wait, one of my favorite books, actually. The letter is in there, but he wrote it in April of 1963, I believe, the 16th of April. But he has that quote in there, and he says, "First, I must confess that over the last few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in the stride towards freedom is not the white citizen counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but is the white moderate who is more devoted to order than justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods or direct actions, who paternalistically feels he can set the timetable for another person's freedom, who lives by the myth of time, who consistently advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection." And when I think of, this particular way of how racism shows up in the name of equity, folks just afraid to do something because they don't want to upset the white power structure, I think of this, that there are people that are more devoted to the order, to the racial status quo than they are to justice, right? But they will hold the meetings, they will hold the convenings, they will hold all these things to get all of these ideas about how we might make this school system more racially just, or this district, or this school, or this classroom more racially just, but won't do it because they will much rather maintain order. And so it looks like equity because they've gotten this input and they've talked to folks, but they allow the same system of advantage to be reproduced and nothing ever changes. And so part of what we have to continue to do is to ask the question of what will you do if your love for justice was greater than any fear? And this is a question I got from one of my good friends and colleagues, Dr. Dakota Irby. When we had a situation happen, I'll never forget, he asked me this question. He essentially said that, his love for justice was greater than fear. And I just kind of formed into a question. I call it the Dakota Irby question. Is this the question we need to ask ourselves, though? What would you do if your love for justice was greater than any fear? Wow. I mean, like, literally, what would you do if your love for racial justice was greater than any fear of any white lash? It was, trying to come back and backlash on the district. What would you do if your love for justice was greater than maintaining the racial status quo? What would you do if your love for justice was greater than maintaining the order? Is a question that we have to continuously and constantly grapple with as we think about this work, as we think about continuing to making our schools, our classrooms, and our districts racially just. Another way that racism in the name of equity can show up, and this is important to think through, is when all of your data is pointing to, for an example, and number of times this has happened with schools and districts, the data is pointing clearly to some racial disparities and racism and inequity and injustice, particularly around Black students, or it might be around Pacific Islander students, or it might be around students who are indigenous. And they're glaring. The data is like the data that the district uses, the data that the states use, the data that, you know what I'm saying? Those metrics are glaring. We're not even talking about the lived experiences and the qualitative data that people are telling you about. That is as powerfully and equally as important. And a lot of times that's disregarded. But I'm talking about the data that the districts use is showing that there's glaring disparities. And here's one of the ways you got that specific group that's being having these horrific and harmful racial experiences, but it'll be framed as all students, right? So the piece that I'm trying to uncover here is that schools and districts can set up a frame to focus on all students when their data shows that Black or Indigenous or Latinx or Asian or Pacific Islander students are having the worst experiences. So in other words, you all lives matter, your data in your equity work, in going back kind of to the idea of maintaining comfort, right? this white power structure number. And we know that to make things better for people on the margins will make it better for people who have been traditionally at the center. We know that from a range of empirical research on education, on disability studies, on universal design or design-based processes. We know that to be the case. But one of the ways we allow racism to continue to function, even in the name of equity, will say a statement like all means all. Well, clearly all doesn't mean all because we're looking at your data. Or we'll say we're doing this for all students. And the reality is, you actually could do it for all students, but the way to do it for all students is not to start with all students. The way to get to all students is to start with those who are on the margins. And when you create the conditions for those who are on the margins, it now has a better condition for all the students who are in that system. But I can't tell you the number of times that people mask the glaring racial injustices and inequities for for black students or other racially minoritized groups, and they frame it as an all students thing. And again, I don't have to make a case around like all students and the value of all that. You get that. You should understand that. But you cannot completely disregard what black students are experiencing and frame it as an all student thing, right? Again, the question now that we need to pose and ask is like, do we know which student groups or group is having the most harmful racial experiences in our school or district or classroom? And then the next part is that, are we committed to naming and centering them in our work to make our entire school and district better, but particularly their lived experiences and their racial experiences? And I'll say that again. Do we know which student group or groups are having the most harmful racial experiences in our school, our district, our organization, our classroom? And are we committed to naming and to centering them in our work to not only make our entire school or class or organization better, but particularly to make their lived experiences significantly better? I hope you got something out of that. There are a myriad of more ways in which racism shows up in the name of equity. And I would love to hear from you. So send me an email, send me a tweet about some of the ways in which you've identified this happening and showing up. And let's think about some of the questions we might ask. Remember, inquiry is our way in, is our way through thinking about new possibilities. And so that's why, I put the questions at the end for you to pose and to ponder and to grapple with individually, collectively, and to constantly revisit, so that these areas of, cloaking racism under the guise of equity won't show up in your work. And as it does show up, like you work through it, you know what I mean? That you are creating new possibilities by asking a different set of questions and not just relying on just these unexamined and common practices that everyone is doing. So hope you got something out of that. I really enjoyed, spending some time with you on this episode. I'm excited about our upcoming episodes. And hey, in the words of my boy, old Marty Marr, see you when I see you. Peace. Well, that is it, folks. Thank you so much for joining Racially Just Schools podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and I am so excited and really looking forward to our time together during future podcasts. What I need you to do is to please hit the subscribe button, share with a friend, and please leave a review. We love reviews. And if you want to hear more from me, you can head on over to www.raciallyjustschools.com. That is www.raciallyjustschools.com. When you join our community, I have a free video for you on 3 tips that will make your racial justice work better. And again, if you love the show, hit subscribe, rate it, and leave a review on iTunes. And until next time, peace.